Welcome, brave listeners. Tonight, I invite you to step into the darkness, to let the unknown whisper in your ear. These are not just stories. They are echoes of something deeper, something that lingers just beyond the veil of reality. Keep the lights low, the volume high, and whatever you do, don't look behind you. Now, let's begin. My name is Daniel Carter. I never planned on coming back here. The house had been abandoned for over 2 decades, ever since my uncle, Richard Carter, was found dead in the upstairs study, his face twisted in terror. No one in my family wanted anything to do with the place after that. It stood there, a forgotten relic of the past, gathering dust and whispers of a tragedy no one spoke about. But I had no choice. After losing my job and struggling to keep up with rent, inheriting the old mansion seemed like a twisted stroke of luck. I convinced myself that I could fix it up, sell it, and move on. That was the plan. The moment I arrived, though, the air around me grew heavy, as if the house itself had been waiting for me. The towering Victorian structure loomed over the overgrown yard, its once grand facade cracked and weathered. Vines snaked up the walls, curling around broken window panes. The iron gate groaned as I pushed it open, and as I approached the front door, an unsettling stillness settled over me. When I pressed my hand against the doorknob, a chill ran up my spine. The metal was ice cold despite the warm autumn air. As I turned the key, the door let out a deep, resonant creak, almost as if it was resisting my entry. Stepping inside, I was immediately hit by a smell: damp wood, aged dust, and something else, something rotten. I wrinkled my nose and exhaled, telling myself it was just decay from years of neglect. But as I took another step, I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible. A whisper. I froze. The sound was so faint that I almost dismissed it as my imagination, the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But there was no wind. The air inside was completely still. Brushing it off, I moved deeper into the house. My boots left faint imprints on the dust-covered floor, and I ran my fingers over the ornate wooden staircase railing. The once lustrous surface was now rough with age, splinters pressing against my skin. I took in my surroundings. High ceilings draped with cobwebs, furniture shrouded in white sheets, the chandelier above coated in thick dust. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I swallowed, forcing myself to keep moving. I had told myself this was just a house. Wood, nails, brick, and stone. But standing there, surrounded by the weight of something unseen, I wasn't so sure anymore. Something was watching me. I could feel it. I spent the first hour exploring, trying to ignore the nagging sense of unease curling in my stomach. Dust and neglect had taken their toll on the house, but beneath it all, I could see its former grandeur. The carved wooden banisters, the intricate moldings along the ceiling. This place had once been magnificent, but something had soured here, something that lingered in the air like a stain that wouldn't wash out. As I moved through the dim hallways, I noticed something strange. The house felt off. The hallway leading from the main foyer to the dining room seemed too long, stretching beyond what I remembered from my childhood visits. I frowned, counting my steps. It was easily 10 feet longer than it should have been. Maybe I was just remembering wrong. Shaking it off, I pushed open a door on the left, expecting the kitchen. Instead, I found myself in a narrow corridor lined with tall bookshelves. That wasn't right. The kitchen had always been on the other side of the house. I closed the door, inhaled deeply, and opened it again. Still the corridor. A shiver crawled up my spine. I backed away and made my way upstairs. As I reached the second floor, my breath caught in my throat. Scratches. Long, deep gouges marred the wallpaper, stretching from the baseboards all the way to the ceiling. They ran parallel, like something with claws had dragged them along the wall with inhuman strength. My fingers hovered over them, hesitating. They were deep, too deep for any animal I could think of. And then I noticed something worse. Some of them looked fresh. The exposed wood beneath was splintered, raw. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The logical part of me wanted to believe they had always been there, and I had simply never noticed, but a sick feeling in my gut told me otherwise. As I turned the corner toward my uncle's old study, movement flickered in the edge of my vision. I snapped my head to the side, but the hallway was empty. I exhaled shakily. Just nerves. I reached for the light switch and flipped it on. The overhead bulb sputtered, flickered, then steadied. The room came into view. Bookshelves lining the walls, an antique desk covered in dust, and a large window overlooking the overgrown backyard. Then the light flickered again, and this time the shadows moved. They weren't just shifting like normal shadows would when a light flickered. They elongated, stretched unnaturally along the walls, curling at the edges like something alive. And for a split second, just before the light steadied again, I swore I saw them reaching toward me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. The house was old. Electrical issues were expected. That's all it was. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Something was wrong here, and it knew I was here. The unease in my chest hadn't faded. Every step deeper into the house felt like peeling back a layer of something that had been waiting, buried beneath dust and silence. But it wasn't until I noticed the paintings that I truly felt fear. They were everywhere. Large, antique portraits lined the halls and rooms, their ornate frames covered in grime, their subjects dressed in old-fashioned clothing. I didn't remember these from when I was a child. Had my uncle collected them over the years? Or had they always been here, unnoticed? I paused in front of one, a man with sharp features and hollow eyes. His black suit blended into the dark background, making his face stand out in an unsettling way. His expression was neutral, but something about it made my skin crawl. I turned away to check the next painting. When my eyes flicked back, my breath hitched. The man's expression had changed. His lips were slightly upturned, the barest hint of a smirk. My stomach tightened. No, that wasn't possible. I had just imagined it. I moved to another painting, this one of a woman in a high-collared dress. Her hair was pinned up tightly, her expression severe. I studied it for a long moment before stepping back. A chill ran down my spine. Her eyes were on me. I wasn't imagining it. The way the light hit the paint made it look like her gaze followed me, tracking my movements across the room. The sensation was unbearable, a pressure on my skin, like something unseen pressing against me. I forced myself to breathe. It was just an illusion, a trick of the artist's technique. Then I saw it. One portrait near the far end of the hallway stood out. The painting itself was cracked, the canvas slightly warped, as if moisture had seeped in over the years. But that wasn't what made my pulse hammer in my throat. The subject, a man with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes, was grinning. Not a friendly smile, but something else. Something wrong. His lips were stretched too wide, teeth bared in a grotesque, unnatural way. I turned away sharply. No, that hadn't been like that before. I was losing it. The stress, the exhaustion, it was all playing tricks on me. I couldn't stand it any longer. Grabbing an old bedsheet from a nearby chair, I moved quickly, draping it over the grinning man's face. Then another for the severe-looking woman. And another. One by one, I covered the portraits until they were nothing but shapeless lumps against the walls. I exhaled, my muscles unclenching slightly. And then, a sound. A slow, deliberate shift of fabric. My blood turned to ice. I turned around, heart hammering, just in time to see the last sheet slide off onto the floor. The grinning man was staring at me, and this time, his smile was even wider. That night, the house made sure I knew I wasn't alone. I had planned to stay in the master bedroom, the one my uncle used before his death. It felt like the safest choice, large, with a heavy wooden door and a lock that still worked. But as I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, I realized that safe was just an illusion. The silence was deep, too deep, the kind that pressed in from all sides, swallowing up the sound of my own breathing. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside my room. My pulse spiked. The boards creaked under an unseen weight, each step measured and patient, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted me to hear. I sat up slowly, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I reached for my phone, hand shaking, but there was no signal. No internet. Nothing. Then came the sound that made my skin crawl. A soft, scraping noise. Something was scratching at the door. Not aggressively, not like an animal clawing to get in, but lightly, almost playfully, as if testing, as if waiting. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to stay still. I didn't want to see whatever was on the other side. I didn't want to give it the satisfaction of knowing it had my attention. Minutes passed. The scratching stopped. Silence. I waited, heart pounding in my ears. Nothing happened. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I told myself it was just the house settling. Old wood, shifting under time and temperature. That was all. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I stepped out into the hallway, scanning the floor for any sign of what might have been there the night before. Nothing. Just dust and my own faint footprints. I went downstairs, deciding I needed coffee, something, anything, to make me feel normal again. But as I reached the bottom step, a door slammed shut somewhere in the house. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. The sound had come from down the hall. I moved cautiously, peering around the corner. One of the doors, the study, was closed now. I was sure it had been opened before. And then I noticed something worse. The door to the library, which had definitely been shut last night, was now wide open. I stared into the darkness beyond, cold dread creeping up my spine. The room was empty, untouched, but the feeling inside was wrong. Heavy, like something had just been there. I backed away slowly, my hands clammy. I needed to get out of this house, even just for a few hours. But then the temperature dropped. A sharp, unnatural coldness filled the air, so sudden and intense that I could see my breath in front of me. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and my fingers ached from the chill. And then, a shadow moved across the far wall. No source, no explanation, just movement. Something was here, and it was getting closer. I woke up feeling drained, like I hadn't truly slept. My dreams were murky, filled with distorted whispers and the sense of something standing just outside my vision. As I pushed myself out of bed, my body stiff and cold, I immediately knew something was wrong. The room had changed. The chair that had been tucked into the corner yesterday was now facing my bed, dead center, as if something had sat there. Watching, I swallowed hard, forcing down the panic bubbling in my chest. I hadn't moved it. I knew I hadn't. I stood, heart hammering, and slowly approached the chair. The air around it felt heavier, almost thick, like I was moving through water. The wood was ice cold beneath my fingers. I backed away, refusing to dwell on it. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I had done this myself and just didn't remember. That's what I told myself. But as the day wore on, the house refused to let me forget. That night, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. A faint murmuring, barely audible. But as I lay there in the darkness, covers pulled up to my chin, I realized these weren't just sounds. They were voices. Low, muted, just beneath the floorboards, inside the walls. They spoke in hushed, hurried tones, as if afraid of being heard. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. This wasn't random noise. It was conversation. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to pretend I couldn't hear them. But then, one whisper grew louder, right next to my ear. Daniel. I bolted upright, gasping. My hands were shaking. The room was empty. The whispers had stopped. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I made up my mind. I was leaving. Selling the house be damned. I'd figure something else out. I just couldn't stay here another night. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and moved straight for the front door. It didn't open. I frowned, twisting the knob harder. Nothing. The deadbolt wouldn't turn, and when I glanced down, my stomach dropped. The locks, both the deadbolt and the handle, were fused together. The metal looked warped, melted as if it had been sealed shut by something inhumanly hot. I stepped back, heart racing. This wasn't possible. I tried the back door. The same. The windows wouldn't budge either, as if they were just part of the walls. I was trapped, and the house knew it. I stumbled into the bathroom, gripping the sink, trying to slow my breathing. Cold sweat dripped down my back. I needed to think, to calm down. I looked up at the mirror and froze. There was someone standing behind me, a tall, shadowed figure, its face indistinct but there. I spun around, nothing. But when I turned back to the mirror, The reflection lingered for a second longer before fading. The house wasn't just haunted. It was watching me. And now, it wasn't hiding anymore. I couldn't stay here. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it wanted me to stay. The locks, the whispers, the figure in the mirror. This wasn't some old building settling into decay. It was something else. Something aware. I grabbed my phone and tried calling for help, but the screen only showed static. My breathing was ragged, my pulse erratic. I needed to get out. Now. Then I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper this time. Not a murmur slipping through the walls. It spoke my name. Daniel. A low, rasping tone, like wine through dead leaves. It came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the air, pressing into my skull. I staggered back, gripping the dresser for balance. My stomach twisted in fear, every instinct screaming that I was not alone in this room. Then, a loud thud. The bedroom door shook. Another, harder. The wood groaned, warping inward as if something enormous was pressing against it from the other side. I backed away, my hands trembling. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help. But what could I do against something I couldn't even see? The lights flickered wildly, the shadows in the corners stretching and twisting like they were alive. And then, movement. In the dim, erratic light, I saw it. Something was crawling toward me from the far end of the room. Not walking, crawling. A dark, shifting shape, just beyond full sight, its limbs too long, its body moving in unnatural jerks. The closer it got, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of damp wood and rot. The walls around me groaned, the entire house seeming to close in, as if it were breathing. The thing inched closer, and then it laughed, a sound that sent ice down my spine. Low, wheezing, filled with something between amusement and hunger. I had seconds, no time to think. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy lamp from the nightstand, and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, shards exploding outward, cold night air rushing in. No hesitation. I climbed onto the sill and jumped. I hit the ground hard, rolling onto the overgrown grass, pain lancing up my arm. But I didn't stop. I ran. I didn't look back. But as I reached the tree line, gasping for breath, I heard it. From the broken window, deep inside that cursed house. The laughter. Low, knowing. Waiting. I didn't stop running until the house was nothing but a dark stain against the horizon. And even then, I knew. It wasn't finished with me. I never spoke of the house again. There was nothing I could say that would make sense to anyone who hadn't felt it, who hadn't stood inside those walls and felt the air pressing in, heard the whispers seeping from the floorboards. I left everything behind. My bag, my clothes, even my uncle's old papers. None of it mattered anymore. I just needed to be gone. But the house wasn't finished with me. The next morning, just as the sun began to rise, I got a call from a neighbor, the only one within a mile of the property. I nearly didn't answer, but something told me I should. "You forgot your things," the man said. My stomach twisted. "What things?" "Your bags. Your stuff. It's all here, neatly packed, sitting right on the porch." I didn't respond. Didn't tell him I had left everything inside the house. Didn't tell him there was no way, anyone, anything should have been able to move them. I just thanked him in a hollow voice and hung up. Days passed, but the fear never left. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. That creeping shape in the darkness, the unnatural grin in the painting, the way the air had felt alive. And then I found out something worse. Digging through old records, I traced the house's last owner. Not my uncle, the man before him. He had disappeared. No warning, no signs of a struggle. Just vanished one night, leaving behind everything he owned. The only thing anyone ever found. His belongings, neatly packed, sitting on the porch, just like mine. I left town that evening, driving without a clear destination, just needing distance. I told myself I would never go back, never look back. But as I reached the last bend in the road, something compelled me, an instinct I wish I had ignored. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and I saw it. A figure, standing at the window of the house, shrouded in shadow, watching. I pressed the gas pedal, hands tightening on the wheel, hard hammering in my chest. I don't know what that thing was. I don't know what it wanted. But I know one thing for certain. It let me go. This time. It started with the noises. At first, they were so faint that I convinced myself they were just the house settling. An old structure breathing in the dead of night. A soft creak here, a whisper of movement there. But as the days passed, the sounds became impossible to ignore. Scratching. Slow, deliberate, as if something just beneath the floorboards was clawing its way up. Some nights, I could hear whispers. Not words, exactly. Just a hushed murmuring that sent ice down my spine. It never lasted long, just a few moments before fading into silence. Each time, I held my breath, straining my ears, hoping I was just imagining it. Then there were the objects. A chair nudged slightly away from the table. A glass that had been on the kitchen counter now on the floor, unbroken but unsettlingly out of place. I would have thought I was losing my mind if not for one simple, undeniable fact. I lived alone. And then, the basement door. For as long as I had been staying in this house, an old rental on the outskirts of town, it had been locked. I had tried opening it when I first moved in, curiosity getting the better of me, but the knob wouldn't turn. The landlord had been vague when I asked about it. Just storage, he had said, quickly changing the subject. But that morning, as I walked into the kitchen, something was different. The door was open. Not wide, just a few inches. But enough. Enough for a whisper of cool, musty air to escape. Enough to reveal the darkened stairwell beyond. I stood frozen, my pulse hammering in my throat. I could ignore it. I could turn away, pretend I hadn't seen it, pretend the noises were nothing, pretend the creeping sense of being watched was just paranoia. Or I could find out what was down there. I swallowed hard and took a step forward. I hesitated at the threshold. The open basement door loomed before me, the darkness beyond seeming thicker than it should have been. My fingers tightened around the flashlight as I took a steadying breath and stepped forward. The first thing that struck me was the temperature. A wave of cold air curled around my ankles, creeping up my spine like unseen fingers. It smelled of damp earth and decay, mold, rotting wood, something faintly metallic beneath it all. The stone steps beneath my feet were old, cracked, and uneven. Each step down felt uncertain, the surface rough beneath my shoes, as if worn by countless footsteps before mine. The deeper I went, the more the air thickened, pressing against my skin with an almost tangible weight. Halfway down, my flashlight flickered. I stopped dead, gripping it tighter. The beams sputtered, casting frantic shadows along the walls, shadows that stretched too far, bending unnaturally, as if something unseen were shifting just beyond the light's reach. Then, without warning, the beam steadied. I exhaled, willing my heartbeat to slow. It was then that I heard it. A murmur. Faint, almost too soft to catch, yet unmistakable. Not a voice, not exactly. More like the rustling of breath against air, a whisper threading through the silence. I swallowed, forcing myself to move again. The basement stretched into darkness below, the light revealing nothing but damp stone walls. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Watching, waiting. A soft breath of cold air brushed against the back of my neck. I froze. There were no vents, no windows, no way for the air to move like that. Slowly, I turned my head, the flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. Nothing, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it, and I had just stepped too far to turn back. The stairs ended in a vast, low-ceilinged chamber, the air thick with dust, and something else, something ancient. My flashlight's beam swept across the room, illuminating the rows of bookshelves that stretched into the darkness. This wasn't just a basement. It was a library. A massive wooden desk stood near the center, coated in a thick layer of dust. A single candle sat on its surface, half melted, its wax pooled over the wood. The sight unsettled me. Who had left it here? And why? The bookshelves lining the walls were filled with old tomes, their spines cracked with age. Some had titles long faded, their words scratched out as if someone wanted to erase them from existence. Others were bound in dark leather, their surfaces worn and brittle. Some books looked untouched, their covers pristine despite the damp air. But others were disturbed. Pages slightly ajar, dust displaced, as if someone had been reading them recently. I reached for one, a small, unassuming volume with a rough, unmarked spine. The leather felt oddly warm beneath my fingers. As I opened it, my stomach tightened. The pages were filled with strange symbols, an unknown script that shifted before my eyes. Lines twisted and reformed as if the ink were alive, refusing to be understood. I shut the book with a sharp breath. And then, thud, a heavy tome crashed to the floor from the shelf beside me, landing with a deafening slap. The sound echoed through the chamber. I spun, my flashlight beam darting wildly. The book lay open, its thick pages fluttering as if caught in an unseen breeze. The words inside writhed, shifting, reshaping, impossible to read, but oddly compelling. My pulse pounded as I crouched down, hesitant fingers reaching for the cover. The moment I touched it, the temperature in the room plummeted. A mark was forming on the leather, a handprint, slowly emerging, as if something unseen had pressed down onto it. And the hand was too large to be human. The air in the basement had changed. It was no longer just thick with dust and decay. It hummed with something unseen, something alive. A soft murmur rose from behind the shelves. At first, it was nothing more than a faint hissing sound, like a distant exhale through clenched teeth. Then came the whispers, dozens of voices, layered atop one another, too quiet to understand, but too present to ignore. I took a step back, my breath shallow. The whispers shifted, and something else joined them, a faint, breathy giggle, light and childlike, but wrong. It was followed by a wet, rasping inhale, as if something was struggling to fill ancient, ruined lungs. I gripped the flashlight tighter and turned, sweeping the beam into the far corners of the room. The shelves stretched into darkness, the books hunched in their places like silent witnesses. Then, movement, a flicker in the periphery of my vision. My heart slammed against my ribs as I jerked the light toward it. Nothing, but the shadows were different. I couldn't place it at first, but something about them was off. They stretched too far, elongated in unnatural directions. And as I stood there, frozen, one of them shifted. Not a trick of the light, not my imagination. Something moved. A shape slid between the shelves, just out of reach. I couldn't see it, only the absence it left behind, the way the darkness rippled around it. I could feel it watching. A sudden whoosh of air sent dust swirling. I whipped around just in time to see the candle on the desk burst into life. The flame rose high, flickering wildly, though there was no wind. It swayed, bending unnaturally toward me, stretching as if it had a mind of its own. And the shadows it cast, they were moving, not with the flicker of the flame, but with intent. Something in this basement wanted me to see it, and it was getting closer. The whispers stopped, not gradually, not like a conversation fading away, but all at once, as if something had pressed an invisible hand over 100 unseen mouths. The silence was worse. My skin prickled, the unmistakable sensation of being watched crawling over me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. My breathing sounded too loud in the stillness, each inhale and exhale amplified by the crushing quiet. I forced my legs to step back, toward the desk. My knee bumped against something beneath it. A box. I crouched, hesitating before pulling it out. It was small, wooden, the lid carved with strange, swirling patterns. My fingers trembled as I pried it open. Inside, two objects sat side by side. The first was a photograph. My breath caught in my throat. It was me. I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, flashlight in hand. But this wasn't possible. I had never been here before tonight. The angle of the photo suggested it had been taken from inside the basement, looking up at me. I shoved the picture aside, my hands shaking, and picked up the second object. A letter. The paper was brittle with age, the ink slightly smudged. But it wasn't the condition that made my stomach drop. It was the handwriting. It was mine. I stared at the loops and curves of my own penmanship, but I had no memory of ever writing this. My fingers tensed as I unfolded the letter, trying to make sense of it. The words blurred together at first, my mind refusing to process them. Then I read the first line. Do not turn around. A chill locked my spine in place. The air around me collapsed into cold. The temperature plummeted so suddenly that my breath turned visible, a ghostly vapor in the dim light. The wooden desk beneath my hand was freezing, as if it had been left in the dead of winter. Then, thud, the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, my grip tightening around the letter. Then, a growl, low, deep, and wrong. It came from the farthest corner of the basement, beyond the bookshelves, beyond the reach of my flashlight. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound animal, either. It sounded hungry, and it was getting closer. The growl deepened, vibrating through the air, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. My legs locked in place, but my instincts screamed at me to move, to run, to get out. Then, a whisper, stronger than before. This time, it wasn't just a murmur. It formed a word. Leave. The voice was neither male nor female, neither loud nor soft. It simply was, sinking into my bones, threading through my thoughts like a command I couldn't disobey. Then the bookshelves exploded. Books flew in all directions, slamming to the floor, the noise deafening in the closed space. Some crashed against the desk. Others hit the walls as if an unseen force was throwing them in a blind rage. Dust swirled in the air, thick and suffocating. I turned. The stairs. I had to reach the stairs. But the door, it was moving. Slowly, steadily, the basement door was swinging shut. I bolted. My feet pounded against the stone steps as I lunged upward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door crept closer to closing, the gap between me and escape narrowing with each second. I made the mistake of looking back. My flashlight beam swept across the basement, and I saw it. A figure stood between the bookshelves, tall, unnaturally tall. Its head nearly brushed the low ceiling, its body wrapped in darkness as if the shadows clung to it. It had no features, no face, just a smooth, empty void where its eyes should have been. And it was watching me. I ran harder, lunging for the top step just as the door neared its final inch of space. I threw myself forward, crashing against it, my hands scrabbling for the handle. And then I was through. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I stumbled forward, gasping, collapsing against the opposite wall of the kitchen. My ears rang with the silence that followed. Then, a single, heavy thud against the door, like something had hit it from the other side. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed. An eternity. Silence returned. For now, I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time, my breath uneven, my hands still trembling. The house around me was silent. No whispers, no footsteps, no shifting shadows. And yet, something felt wrong. The air was lighter than before, as if the house had exhaled after holding its breath. But the sensation of being watched hadn't disappeared. It clung to the back of my neck, just beyond my senses, waiting. I forced myself to stand. My legs protested, weak from adrenaline, but I needed to check something. The basement door. I moved cautiously, each step measured. When I reached it, my breath caught in my throat. It was locked. Not just shut, locked. As if it had never been open in the first place. I pressed my palm against the wood. It was warm, impossibly warm, as though someone had just been standing on the other side. I swallowed hard and stepped back. My eyes flicked toward the bookshelves in the living room. Something was nagging at me, something small, but wrong. The book, the one that had fallen. It was back on the shelf, exactly where it had been before. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I turned toward the kitchen. The candle, the half-melted candle that had burned so violently in the basement. It was untouched, unlit, and now, completely melted, as if it had never been used. My chest tightened. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but there was none. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I flinched. My nerves were raw, every sound magnified. With shaky hands, I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A notification. New photo, saved to camera roll. My stomach dropped. I hadn't taken any pictures. With a slow, reluctant movement, I opened my gallery. The most recent image loaded. My breath stalled in my throat. It was a photo of the basement, dimly lit, taken from my perspective, but I never took it. And in the shadows, standing between the bookshelves, was a tall, featureless figure, staring directly at the camera. I dropped the phone, my body locked in place, terror coursing through my veins like ice. The house was silent, but I knew now. I wasn't alone. I never had been. I should have reached my destination by now. The clock on my dashboard glowed 1:37 a.m., the numbers casting an eerie green hue over my hands on the steering wheel. I had been driving for what felt like forever, yet the road ahead remained the same. An endless stretch of cracked asphalt, flanked by towering pine trees that seemed to close in the farther I went. No signs, no turnoffs, no familiar landmarks. Just the dark road and the heavy silence pressing in on me. The only sound was the steady hum of my tires against the pavement, occasionally interrupted by the distant cry of some unseen night creature. I turned up the heater. It had been working fine earlier, but now, no matter how high I set it, a strange chill settled into the car. The air felt damp, almost clammy, like the inside of a cave. I rubbed my hands together, trying to warm them up, but they stayed ice cold. My phone lay on the passenger seat, the GPS still open. I glanced at it again, hoping for some reassurance. But something was off. The screen showed the same stretch of road I had just passed minutes ago, as if I had gone in a circle. I frowned and tapped the screen, refreshing the app. The blue navigation line blinked, then redrew itself in the exact same position. The estimated arrival time hadn't changed either. It was stuck at 24 minutes remaining, just as it had been 20 minutes ago. A shiver crawled up my spine. I knew I had been driving straight. There hadn't been any turns, no way I could have looped back. I checked the rearview mirror. The road behind me looked identical to the one ahead, dark, empty, endless. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the GPS had lost connection out here in the middle of nowhere. But that didn't explain the cold creeping through my bones. I exhaled sharply and refocused on the road. I just needed to keep driving. Eventually, I'd see a sign, a gas station, anything. I had to. Then, just as I convinced myself to push forward, the headlights flickered. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And in that brief moment of darkness, I could have sworn I saw something standing on the side of the road. The headlights flickered again, the brief darkness making my pulse jump. I tightened my grip on the wheel, jaw clenched. Just electrical issues, I told myself. Nothing unusual for an old car. Then the radio crackled to life. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even turned it on during the drive. But suddenly, a burst of static filled the car, sharp and grating, like someone twisting the dial between dead stations. I winced, reaching toward the console to shut it off. But before I could, something cut through the static, a voice. At first, it was just a whisper. A few syllables, garbled and stretched, impossible to make out. My heart hammered in my chest. It was probably just interference, I reasoned. Some weak AM signal bouncing off the hills. But then, as I turned the dial, searching for an explanation, the whisper shifted. It became clearer. It said my name. Not just once, but twice. The first time was almost questioning, like someone searching for me. The second was a confirmation. I yanked my hand back like the dial had burned me. The voice cut off abruptly, and the radio fell silent again. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes back to the road. Just as I did, my headlights caught something in the distance. A figure, standing at the edge of the road, barely illuminated by the glow of my high beams. My foot hovered over the brake, but before I could slow down, the figure was gone. Vanished, like it had never been there at all. I blinked rapidly, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. The trees stood motionless, their branches clawing at the sky. I let out a shaky breath and pressed down on the gas, pushing forward. But the further I drove, the heavier the feeling in my chest became. I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, I swore I saw something move in the back seat. But when I turned around, the car was empty. Yet the feeling remained, an overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone anymore. The silence inside the car was suffocating. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself I was imagining things. The voice on the radio, the figure by the roadside. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A soft, rhythmic knocking from above. I froze, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. The taps were light at first, like fingertips drumming against the metal roof. Perfectly spaced. Precise. Tap, tap, tap. A chill crept up my spine. It almost sounded like someone crawling. I forced myself to keep driving, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. My headlights carved a path through the darkness, but the road remained empty. No signs of fallen branches, no debris that could explain the noise. Then the tapping grew louder, more insistent. A heavy shift, like weight being distributed across the roof of the car. My breath caught in my throat. I could almost picture it, something up there, moving, adjusting its position. I slowed down just slightly. If something had fallen onto my car, it would slide off, right? But nothing did. The tapping stopped, and that's when I saw it. The windshield was fogging up from the inside. I blinked, watching as the condensation thickened, spreading unnaturally fast across the glass. My stomach twisted. The heater wasn't even running. There was no reason for this. Then, right in front of me, a shape began to form. A handprint. It pressed against the glass, the fingers splayed wide. My blood ran cold. I stared, frozen, as the outline sharpened. The fingers looked too long, almost inhuman. I swallowed hard and reached out with a trembling hand. Slowly, I wiped at the condensation, smearing the print away. For a second, everything was still. Then, from above me, a deep, guttural scrape. Something was dragging itself across the roof, and it wasn't leaving. My heart pounded in my chest as the scraping above me stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. My fingers locked around the steering wheel so tightly they ached. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road. Just drive. Just get out of here. Then, in the corner of my vision, something shifted. My gaze flicked to the rearview mirror. There, just barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard, was a shape. A tall, dark figure sat in the back seat. I couldn't breathe. I could see it so clearly in the reflection. A hunched form, its head slightly tilted, its body impossibly still. No, I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The seat was empty. A cold sweat broke out along my neck. My pulse roared in my ears. I turned back to the mirror, hoping, praying. I had imagined it. But now, the figure was closer. I choked back a gasp, my throat going dry. It was leaning forward now, its shape pressing into the space behind me, though I could feel nothing. Then the radio clicked on. The static exploded through the speakers, sharp and violent. But underneath the noise, something else stirred. A voice. The same whisper from before, but this time it was clearer. Closer. Don't look. The words slithered directly into my ear, as if someone was sitting right beside me. I squeezed my eyes shut for half a second, my hands shaking on the wheel. Don't look. I knew I shouldn't. I knew I had to keep driving. But against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I glanced back at the mirror. The figure's face was inches from mine. A twisted mouth. Hollow, sunken eyes. A darkness that swallowed everything. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. And then, it smiled. I couldn't feel my hands anymore. I was gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles had turned bone white, but they felt distant, disconnected from me. My breathing was shallow, my chest locked tight with fear. The thing in the mirror was gone, or at least I couldn't see it anymore. I forced my eyes to stay on the road, trying to shove the image out of my mind. The twisted mouth, the hollow, watching eyes. But the feeling hadn't left. I knew, deep in my gut, that I was still not alone. Then, up ahead, something broke the monotony of the endless stretch of asphalt. A car. It sat motionless on the shoulder, barely visible in the darkness. No hazard lights. No movement. Just a silent, waiting presence. I swallowed hard and eased my foot off the gas, slowing as I approached. The driver's seat was empty. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe someone slumped over the wheel, maybe a shadow shifting inside. But there was nothing. The interior was dark, the windshield reflecting only my own headlights. Then I noticed the back door. It was open, not all the way, just slightly, like someone had stepped out and forgotten to close it. Or like something had left. A fresh wave of cold fear crept up my spine. I hit the gas, my car lurching forward. I didn't care what had happened to that driver. I wasn't stopping. Then, the radio screamed. A blast of static, louder than before, so sharp and violent that I winced. My ears rang, pain shooting through my skull. I reached for the dial, fumbling to turn it off, but before I could, the whispering returned. Frantic now, breathing hard, as if the voice was right next to me, gasping for air. And then, laughter. Low, amused. Wrong. You should have stopped. The words slithered through the static, curling around my brain like fingers. My stomach dropped. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. Something shifted inside the abandoned car's back seat. I didn't slow down. I didn't blink. I just pressed my foot hard against the gas, speeding away, my hands trembling on the wheel. My heart was hammering so fast I thought it might burst. But then, in my rearview mirror, the abandoned car's headlights flicked on, and it began to follow me. The headlights in my rearview mirror burned into my skull. The abandoned car was moving, chasing me, but I couldn't see a driver. The wheel turned on its own, the engine roared, but the front seat remained empty. I pressed the gas pedal as hard as I could. The speedometer climbed 60, 70, 80, but no matter how fast I went, the car stayed right behind me. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but something was wrong. The edges of my vision blurred, the trees lining the highway twisting, darkening. The road itself seemed to stretch and shrink, warping in a way that made my stomach churn. Then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. Their bodies were barely more than shadows, tall and still among the trees. Watching, my breath hitched. I wanted to scream, to deny what I was seeing, but I felt them. Their presence pressed against my skull, a weight I couldn't escape. The radio crackled again. The voice was soft this time, almost gentle. "You've already arrived." My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I slammed the brakes. Tires screeched. My body lurched forward, my hands gripping the wheel in a death grip. And in that instant, the headlights behind me vanished. No crash, no impact, just nothing. The road behind me was empty, but I wasn't alone. Something was still there, watching, waiting. I could feel it, and I knew this wasn't over. The silence was unbearable. The road ahead was just road again, dark pavement stretching into the distance, the trees no longer shifting, no figures standing in the shadows. My hands trembled on the wheel, but the car felt normal. The GPS flickered back to life. For the first time in hours, or had it been minutes, the screen showed my route, a straight shot home. No more glitches, no endless loops, just a clear path forward. I checked the dashboard. The heater worked. The radio was silent. The car responded as it should, like nothing had ever happened. But my body wouldn't stop shaking. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced myself to keep driving. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. Nothing was there, just the empty backseat. I was alone, wasn't I? A cold prickle crawled up my spine. I reached for my phone, desperate for a distraction, for anything to ground me back in reality. Maybe I could call someone, hear a human voice, prove to myself that I was really here, that I had escaped. I unlocked the screen. No missed calls, no messages. But there was something new. A photo. I hadn't taken any pictures tonight. My hands were on the wheel the whole time. I knew that. But there it was. A single, freshly saved image in my gallery. My breath caught as I tapped on it. It was a shot from my phone's rear camera. The inside of my car. The back seat. And sitting there, in the exact spot I had glanced at so many times. A dark figure. Smiling. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped into the hotel lobby. It wasn't anything obvious. No peeling wallpaper, no broken furniture, no eerie background music playing from nowhere. But there was a feeling, a heaviness in the air, like the place had been holding its breath for too long. The receptionist barely looked up when I approached the front desk. She was an older woman with deep wrinkles that carved into her pale skin like cracks in porcelain. Her uniform was neat but outdated, and when she finally acknowledged me, her voice was flat, like she had spoken the same words 1,000 times before. "Welcome. Name," I told her, and she slid a worn ledger toward me instead of a digital check-in screen. The paper was yellowed at the edges. No computer, no modern touches, just a single brass key with an engraved number, room 306. The moment the key touched my palm, a sharp chill ran up my arm. I rubbed my hand against my coat, but the cold clung to my skin. The receptionist didn't seem to notice. She simply nodded toward the hallway behind her. "The elevator's out. Stairs are to your right." I turned, expecting to hear a polite "enjoy your stay." Instead, silence followed me as I walked away. The hallway was unnaturally long. The dim, yellowish lighting cast warped shadows on the patterned carpet, and every step I took felt muffled, like the floor absorbed sound. I counted the doors as I passed: 301, 302, 303, but somehow, the hallway seemed to stretch further than it should. The air smelled stale, musty, like old books left to rot in a damp basement. When I finally reached room 306, I hesitated. Something about the door was off. It wasn't damaged or particularly old, but it felt wrong, like it didn't quite belong in the same time as the rest of the building. I pressed the key into the lock. The metal was ice cold. The door was heavier than it should have been, resisting as I pushed it open. The hinges let out a soft creak, not loud enough to be unnatural, but just enough to send a shiver up my spine. I stepped inside, switched on the light, and let the door swing shut behind me. That's when I saw it. Across the room, directly opposite the bed, stood a tall, antique mirror. The frame was dark wood, almost black, carved with intricate patterns that looked like twisting vines. The glass had a strange quality to it, not dirty, but slightly blurred, like it was hiding something just beneath the surface. I swallowed hard. Something about that mirror made my skin crawl. I dropped my bag onto the chair by the window and turned back toward the bed, only to find my own reflection staring at me from the mirror across the room. It was large, nearly as tall as I was, with an ornate wooden frame that curled like creeping vines. The glass wasn't cracked or dirty, but something about it was off. The surface seemed subtly warped, just enough to make the room inside look like it was breathing, shifting ever so slightly. I frowned. Was it just an old mirror with imperfections? A trick of the lighting? I stepped closer, studying my reflection. Everything was where it should be. Same dark jacket, same tired eyes, same faint crease in my forehead. But then, just as I was about to turn away, my reflection smiled. I didn't. A slow, deliberate curl of the lips spread across my mirrored face, something almost playful, almost knowing. My breath caught in my throat as a wave of cold washed over me. I blinked hard and took a step back. The reflection was normal again, expressionless, still. I let out a shaky breath. I must be more exhausted than I thought. Shaking it off, I turned my back to the mirror, but the unease stayed with me. The room was quiet, too quiet. No distant sound of guests in the hall, no humming of pipes or faint traffic outside. Just silence, thick and pressing. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept my gaze on my suitcase as I unzipped it, forcing myself not to turn around. But the awareness of the mirror gnawed at the back of my mind. It felt as if something was watching, waiting. A slow chill spread from the back of my neck down to my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore one thing. The air near the mirror was colder, and the longer I stood in that room, the more I felt like I was being watched. I tried to shake the feeling off. It's just an old mirror, just a trick of the light. But my stomach was still tight with unease as I stepped into the small bathroom. I let the water run in the sink, splashing my face to clear my mind. The coolness helped, grounding me back to reality. It's just exhaustion. That's all. I reached for a towel, dabbing my face dry, and when I looked up, I froze. In the mirror, just over my shoulder, something shifted. A figure stood in the dim light of my hotel room, barely visible in the warped reflection. The shape was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured beneath the deep hood of something long and tattered. It wasn't moving, but I could feel it watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around. Nothing. The room behind me was empty. The bed was untouched, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the night. The only sound was the faint dripping of the faucet. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I didn't imagine that. I stepped back into the room, glancing around as if expecting something to be lurking in the corners. The air felt heavier, pressing in against me, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. Slowly, cautiously, I turned to face the mirror again. I lifted my hand, waving it in front of the glass. My reflection followed, but a second too slow. I frowned and did it again, this time more deliberately. The delay was there, subtle but undeniable. Something was wrong with this mirror. Heart pounding, I leaned in closer, studying my reflection. My own face stared back at me, eyes wide with unease. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, I didn't move, but my reflection did. It stood, motionless, staring, unblinking. A breath, soft, cold, brushed against my ear. I spun around again. No one was there, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it, and the mirror, silent and still, was watching. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart still unsteady from what I'd seen in the mirror. The next, I was somewhere else. No, not somewhere else. Inside the mirror. At first, I didn't understand. The hotel room stretched out in front of me. Same dim lighting, same heavy curtains, same patterned carpet. But something was wrong. I couldn't move. I was inside the glass, staring out, like I was a reflection that had been trapped. I tried to lift my hands, to press against the surface, but my body wouldn't respond. My chest tightened in panic. Let me out. I tried to scream, but no sound came. Then I saw it. Me. Or at least, something wearing my face. It stood in the hotel room, outside the mirror, looking directly at me. But there was something off. Its expression wasn't quite right. The corners of its mouth curled up in a slow, deliberate smile. I watched, helpless, as my reflection, no, not me, raised a hand and waved. Then it turned toward the door and walked away, leaving me trapped. I thrashed, or at least I tried to, but my body wouldn't move. The glass felt like an unbreakable barrier between me and the real world. I could do nothing but watch as the thing wearing my face disappeared from view. No, 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 no. I jolted awake, gasping. The room was dark, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. My skin was slick with sweat, but the bed beneath me was cold. I sat up, breathing hard, trying to shake the lingering weight of the nightmare. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The mirror. Before I had gone to sleep, I had covered it with a spare blanket, too uneasy to let it sit exposed in my room. Now, the blanket was gone. The mirror was uncovered, standing silent, waiting. A chill crawled up my spine. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something else. Footprints. Faint impressions in the carpet, leading from the mirror to the bathroom. I wasn't alone. I never had been. I sat frozen, my breath shallow, my eyes locked on the footprints in the carpet. My mind raced for an explanation. Had I sleepwalked? Had someone been in my room? But deep down, I already knew. Something was wrong with that mirror. The room was silent. Too silent. Even the usual hum of distant traffic or the soft creaks of an old building settling had vanished. The air felt thick, pressing down on me, wrapping around my throat like invisible hands. Then, a giggle. Soft, muffled, like someone laughing through fabric or from behind a closed door. It wasn't outside. It wasn't in the hallway. It was coming from inside the mirror. I stopped breathing. The sound was distant but distinct, childlike but wrong, stretched in a way that made my stomach twist. I forced myself to sit up, my entire body rigid. The mirror loomed across the room, its glass reflecting the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The frame looked darker now, the carved vines twisting like they had grown while I slept. I swallowed hard and turned on the light. The brightness flooded the room, pushing back the heavy darkness. And that's when I saw it. My reflection blinked, but a second too late. The delay was subtle but undeniable. I blinked again, testing it. The mirrored version of me followed, just a beat behind. I leaned forward slightly. The reflection didn't move. It just stood there, staring. Then, slowly, so faint I almost missed it, the outline of fingers pressed against the inside of the glass. Not my fingers, something else. The handprint lingered for a moment before fading, dissolving into the darkness of the mirror like it had never been there at all. A chill slid down my spine, deeper than before, settling into my bones. I was not alone in this room, and whatever was with me was trying to get out. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the mirror. This isn't happening. This is exhaustion, stress, sleep deprivation. I needed to sleep. That's all. Gritting my teeth, I grabbed a towel from the bathroom and pinned it over the mirror, making sure it covered every inch of the glass. I didn't care how ridiculous it looked. I just couldn't stand the idea of waking up to see it staring back at me. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up tight. The hotel room felt colder than before, the air heavier. Every creak of the old building sent my pulse spiking. But eventually, exhaustion won. I slept. A dull thump woke me. My eyes snapped open. The room was still dark. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, my body tense. Something was different. I sat up, my skin prickling with dread. That's when I saw it. The towel I had pinned over the mirror? It was no longer there. Instead, it was neatly folded on the floor. Not crumpled, not tossed aside. Folded, as if someone had carefully removed it. I forced down the panic clawing up my throat and flicked on the bedside lamp. The yellow glow cast long shadows across the room, warping the familiar shapes. And that's when I noticed the second thing. The chair. When I had gone to sleep, it had been by the window. Now, it was facing the bed, as if someone had been sitting there, watching me sleep. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, every nerve in my body screaming for me to leave. But my breath hitched when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. The bathroom door. I knew I had shut it before going to bed. But now, it stood slightly ajar, a crack of darkness splitting the frame. The air inside looked thicker, darker. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. Then, slowly, I turned my head toward the mirror. The glass was clear again, untouched. But my reflection, something was wrong. At first glance, it looked like me. Same clothes, same posture. But the details. My hands looked thinner, bonier. My eyes, too wide, too dark. And then, my reflection moved its lips. A whisper, so faint I almost didn't hear it. I leaned closer, straining to make out the words. My reflection's mouth curved into a slow, unnatural smile. And then it spoke. But the voice didn't come from the mirror. It came from right behind me. A shiver of pure terror ripped through me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't turn around. The voice had come from behind me, but I was alone. Wasn't I? I grabbed my bag with trembling hands, barely bothering to shove my things inside. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst through my ribs. I needed to leave. Now, fumbling, I yanked the door open and stepped into the hallway. Everything felt wrong. The corridor stretched longer than before. Too long. The dim, flickering lights seemed farther apart, casting strange, shifting shadows. The silence was suffocating. No humming from vending machines, no distant voices from other rooms. Just the faint echo of my own footsteps. I hurried toward the elevator, jabbing at the button. The doors didn't open. I hit it again. Nothing. My pulse hammered in my ears. No time to wait. The stairwell. I turned and bolted for it, gripping the cold metal railing as I rushed down, my breath ragged, my legs shaking. Floor after floor, I ran, the heavy air pressing against me, dragging me down. By the time I reached the lobby, my chest was tight with exhaustion and panic. The reception desk was empty. The chair behind it sat neatly pushed in, as if no one had been there at all. The old-fashioned bell on the counter gleamed under the dim lobby lights. I hesitated, then slammed my hand against it, the sharp ding echoing through the vast emptiness. Nothing. No one. I turned to the front doors, heart hammering. If they were locked, if I was trapped here. I pushed. The doors opened. A flood of cold night air hit my face. I gasped, stepping out onto the sidewalk, my entire body trembling. I made it. The street was empty, silent except for the faint buzz of a street lamp flickering overhead. I forced my breathing to slow, gripping the strap of my bag like a lifeline. I needed to get as far away from this place as possible. But then, something made me stop. Across the lobby, near the reception desk, stood a massive decorative mirror, its gilded frame towering over the check-in counter. And in it, I saw myself. Or at least, I saw something that looked like me. But my reflection wasn't moving. It wasn't mirroring me at all. It stood perfectly still, hands at its sides, staring straight ahead. And then, ever so slightly, it smiled. I never spoke about that night. Not to my colleagues, not to my friends, not even to myself. I checked out of another hotel the next morning, hundreds of miles away, exhausted and rattled, but grateful to be anywhere else. I didn't sleep well for weeks after that. Every mirror in every room I stayed in was either covered or avoided entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I had left something behind, or that something had followed me. But I convinced myself it was over, until I checked my phone. It was 2 days later, in the middle of an airport lounge, when I idly scrolled through my photo gallery. Most of the pictures were normal screenshots, old vacation photos, a few blurry images from my last meeting. Then I found it. A picture I didn't remember taking. A photo of my hotel room, taken from inside the mirror. My blood ran cold. The angle was all wrong. It was as if the image had been captured from deep within the glass, looking out into the room. The bed was still unmade. My suitcase was still half-zipped, just as I had left it. The lighting was dim, the atmosphere heavy with something I couldn't name. And there, in the center of the frame, was me. Or at least, the thing wearing my face. It sat on the bed, its hands resting motionless on its lap. It was staring straight at the camera, at me, but its eyes were wrong. Hollow, dark, and it was smiling. I slammed my phone face down on the table, my breath shallow, my hands clammy. I didn't want to look at it again, didn't want to know if it was still there. But I already knew. I had left the hotel that night, but I wasn't sure I had ever truly left. Or worse, I wasn't sure if I was the one who had made it out. I wasn't planning to buy anything that day. I had stepped into the antique shop more out of curiosity than necessity. My new house still had empty corners, and I thought an old piece or two might give it some character. The shop was one of those places that seemed frozen in time, dimly lit, thick with the scent of aged wood and dust, its aisles packed with forgotten relics. The shopkeeper, an older man with deep-set eyes and a voice like rusted hinges, barely acknowledged me as I wandered through the narrow pathways. My fingers trailed along wooden dressers, brass lamps, and ceramic vases, all whispering of lives long past. Then, in a shadowed corner, I saw it. A Victorian-era rocking chair. It was unlike anything else in the shop. The dark wood was smooth and cool to the touch, its surface adorned with intricate carvings, twisting vines, curling roses, and at the top, just below the arch of the backrest, a pair of eyes. They weren't immediately obvious, hidden within the details, but once I noticed them, I couldn't look away. The upholstery, though worn, was surprisingly intact, deep burgundy with a faint floral pattern. It didn't match the decay of the rest of the piece. Something about it felt off. Beautiful, isn't it? The shopkeeper's voice rasped behind me. I turned, startled. He was watching me with an unreadable expression. How much? I asked. He hesitated. His fingers drummed against the glass counter as he glanced toward the chair. That one's been here a long time, he muttered. Belonged to a woman, widow, I think. Sat in it every day by her window. Said it helped her feel less alone. There was something unsaid in his words. Something I wasn't supposed to ask about. I'll take it, I said, ignoring the unease settling in my stomach. The transaction was quick. Too quick. The shopkeeper wrapped my change in a crumpled receipt and pushed it into my palm as if eager to be done with it. As I wheeled the chair toward the door, the shop's dim bulbs flickered. For a moment, the entire shop seemed to hold its breath. Then, just as I stepped outside, the heavy wooden door groaned and swung shut behind me. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to a draft. I should have turned back, should have taken it as a sign, but I didn't. I took the chair home. I placed the chair in the attic. It wasn't intentional at first. The attic was meant for storage, half-empty boxes, old suitcases, things I hadn't found a place for yet. But something about the chair felt like it belonged there. I positioned it near the window, where it had a clear view of the street below. It was just a harmless decoration, a piece of the past nestled among forgotten things. That night, I lay in bed listening to the silence of the house. The kind of silence that isn't truly quiet. A low hum of existence filled the space, pipes settling, the wind against the roof. Then, somewhere above me, I heard it. A faint creaking. Not loud, not obvious, just soft, rhythmic sounds, as if the wood above was adjusting to the night air. The house was old, I reasoned. It was bound to make noises. Still, something about it sat wrong in my chest. When I climbed up to the attic the next morning, the air was colder than the rest of the house. Not the usual stale warmth of an enclosed space, but a crisp, unnatural chill. I checked the window. It was closed, latched securely. The chair sat exactly where I had left it. Yet as I stood there, something made me hesitate. The way the morning light hit the attic floor, casting long shadows from the stacked boxes. The chair's shadow stretched farther than it should have, curling slightly, as if reaching toward me. I swallowed hard, shaking off the thought. It was just a chair. And yet, every time I passed by the attic door, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching me. The first time I heard it, I thought I was dreaming. A slow, deliberate creaking. Rhythmic. Measured. I glanced at my phone, 3 a.m. Fully awake now, I strained my ears, heart thudding. The sound wasn't coming from inside my bedroom. It was above me. The attic. I sat up, waiting, breath held. The creaking continued for another minute, then stopped abruptly, like whatever had been moving knew I was listening. The rational part of my mind told me it was nothing. Houses settle, which shifts with temperature changes. But I still found myself climbing the attic stairs, flashlight in hand. The moment I opened the door, I felt it. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like damp wool. It wasn't just cold, it was heavy. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, landing on the rocking chair. It was still, perfectly still. I exhaled a shaky laugh, half embarrassed. Of course it wasn't moving. I was being ridiculous. And yet, as I turned to go back downstairs, I felt something at my back. A presence. A weightless pressure, like invisible fingertips resting on my shoulder. I hurried back to bed. The next morning, I went back up to the attic. I told myself it was just to check, just to prove that nothing was wrong. The chair had moved. Not by much, but enough. It no longer faced the window. It was turned slightly, angled toward the attic door. I stood there, heartbeat hammering in my throat. I hadn't touched it. No one else had been in the house. Maybe I had misremembered its position. Maybe the floor was uneven. I adjusted it back to its original spot, laughed off my nerves, and told myself to stop being so paranoid. But the next morning, it had moved again. This time, turned even more toward the door. By the third night, it was directly facing the entrance. I stopped going into the attic. A few days later, I noticed something else. The air in the attic wasn't just cold anymore, it was damp. The wooden floor beneath the chair looked darker, like it had absorbed moisture. When I pressed my fingers against it, the boards gave slightly, too soft under my touch, like they were rotting from the inside out. And the other furniture, the old suitcases, the wooden storage chest, they had scratches. Long, jagged lines, as if something with sharp nails had crawled over them. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong with that chair, and it was getting closer. I should have gotten rid of it. By then, the signs were undeniable. The creaking at night, the shifting position, the way the attic felt wrong. But something about the chair held me in place, like an unspoken challenge, daring me to look closer. So I did. It started with the fabric. I ran my hand over the worn burgundy upholstery, fingers catching on something coarse. At first, I thought it was just loose threads, but when I looked closer, I saw them, strands of black hair. Thin, brittle, tangled deep in the weave. I plucked one free, but it didn't come out easily. Some strands seemed almost fused with the fabric, as though they had been pressed into it over time. The idea made my stomach turn. Who had sat here long enough for their hair to become part of the chair? And why did it feel like I had just disturbed something that wanted to be left alone? My unease deepened as I examined the wooden armrests. They were smooth at first glance, but when I traced my fingers along them, I felt tiny grooves carved into the surface. Faint scratches, almost like tally marks. I pulled my phone's flashlight closer, angling the light just right. The marks weren't random. They formed letters. Words. I sucked in a breath. The letters were uneven, shaky, as if carved with fingernails. I yanked my hand back, heart hammering. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I wasn't just imagining this. Someone had suffered here. Someone had left a message, and no one had listened. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to prove I wasn't afraid. Maybe I wanted to see if I was imagining things. I lowered myself onto the chair. The moment I sat down, a chill rushed up through my body. Not the kind of cold you feel in winter, but a deep, unnatural cold, one that seemed to seep into my bones. And then, the sadness. A wave of it, raw and suffocating. It wasn't mine. It didn't belong to me. It was old, buried, festering in the fabric, in the wood, in the very essence of the chair. Tears pricked my eyes. Not from fear, not from pain, but from a grief so profound I couldn't breathe. I gripped the armrests, trying to steady myself, when something made me look up. There was a mirror across the attic, reflecting me. But my reflection was wrong. For just a second too long, it didn't move with me. It sat there, staring back. And then it smiled. I stopped going into the attic. I stopped thinking about the chair. But it didn't stop thinking about me. The nightmares started soon after. Each night, I dreamed of the attic, of the chair sitting by the window, its dark wood gleaming in the moonlight. But I wasn't alone. A figure sat in it, thin, gaunt, wrapped in shadows. It rocked, slow and deliberate, back and forth, back and forth. Its head tilted slightly, as if watching me. No matter how hard I tried, I could never see its face, but I could feel its gaze. And then, the whispering began. A voice, dry, rasping, drifting down from the attic whenever I lay in bed. You took my place. Some nights, I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Other nights, I stayed awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the whispers to start again. I knew they would. They always did. A week later, I found the attic door blocked. It wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pushed. My stomach twisted as I realized why. The chair was pressed against it. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even gone upstairs. But somehow, it had moved. At first, I told myself it was just an accident. Maybe I had left it too close to the door. Maybe I had brushed against it without realizing. But deep down, I knew better. And then, one night, I heard it. A rattling. Not the wind. Not the house settling. The attic door was shaking. I stood frozen in the hallway, barely able to breathe. The knob trembled. The wood groaned. Something was pressing against it from the other side. I took a step back, then another. The rattling stopped, but the silence that followed was worse, because suddenly I knew it was waiting for me to open the door. I started avoiding the attic completely, but the chair didn't care. One night, as I passed by the attic stairs, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a shape sitting in the chair. It was just a glimpse, a flicker in my peripheral vision, but I knew it was there. I turned my head sharply. The chair was empty, but it was rocking, slowly, back and forth, back and forth. And then, ever so softly, I heard it again. You took my place. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the shifting chair, the nightmares that felt more real than dreams ever should. The presence that watched me, even when I was alone. I had to get rid of it. That night, I marched up to the attic with one goal, to remove the chair from my house forever. But the moment I grabbed it, I knew something was wrong. It was heavier than it should have been. Much heavier. The wood should have been solid, but it felt like I was dragging something alive, something that resisted. I gritted my teeth and hauled it down the stairs, nearly stumbling as its weight pulled against me. Every step felt harder, as though the house itself was fighting to keep it inside. I made it to the backyard, gasping for breath, and grabbed the lighter fluid. I doused the chair in it, my hands shaking. Then I struck a match and tossed it onto the seat. Nothing happened. The flame flickered, then died. I tried again. Another match. Another failure. The wood refused to burn. It was like the chair wouldn't let itself be destroyed. I stared at it, cold dread crawling up my spine. Then, from the attic window above me, I heard a sound that shouldn't have been possible. Creak. My stomach twisted. The chair was outside, right in front of me. And yet, I still heard it rocking. Desperate, I grabbed my phone and started searching. There had to be something, some history, some explanation for what was happening. And then I found it. An old newspaper article, dated nearly a century ago. The headline sent ice through my veins. My breath hitched as I read the rest. Her name was Eleanor Vance, a widow who had lived alone, reclusive, in a house that once stood on this very land. She had spent years sitting in her attic, rocking, watching the world pass her by. And then, one night, she died. When they found her, she was still seated in the chair, her bony hands gripping the armrest so tightly they had to pry her fingers free. Her last words? "Don't sit in my chair." A loud, echoing creak snapped me out of my trance. I turned. The chair was rocking violently on its own, back and forth, back and forth. The air around me turned ice cold. My breath came in ragged gasps as the shadows around the chair darkened, deepened, stretched. And then it appeared. A figure, seated in the chair. Thin, skeletal, its pale skin stretched too tightly over its skull. Sunken, hollow eyes fixed directly on me. A grin split its face, revealing rotted, broken teeth. It knew I had tried to get rid of it. And it was angry. The attic door above me slammed shut. I barely had time to scream. I don't remember how I got inside. I don't remember how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind blank with terror. But when morning came, and the first rays of sunlight cut through my window, I forced myself to move. I had to know. I climbed the attic stairs, my limbs stiff and unsteady. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave whatever had happened the night before unquestioned. But I had to see. The attic was silent. The air felt lighter, almost empty. The chair was gone. I searched every inch of the house, the backyard, the street outside. There was no sign of it, no trace that it had ever existed. Had I finally rid myself of it? Or had it simply moved on? That night, for the first time in weeks, I felt relief. I told myself it was over, that whatever had haunted me was gone. And then, at exactly 3 a.m., I woke up. A single, slow creak echoed from the attic. My blood turned to ice. Another creak. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. It wasn't possible. The chair was gone, wasn't it? The next morning, I forced myself back into the attic. I knew what I was looking for, and I found it. In the empty space where the chair had once sat, where the wood had been softened and darkened, something lay on the floor. A single, brittle strand of black hair. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. But the moment I touched it, a cold shiver ran through me, deep, hollow, familiar. I left the attic without looking back. I never went up there again. And every night, at 3 a.m., I still hear it. Creak. Back and forth. Back and forth. I let out a breath as I stepped off the elevator onto the 3rd floor of my apartment building. It had been a long day, longer than I wanted to think about, and all I needed was to get inside, shut the door, and collapse into bed. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by those old yellow bulbs the landlord never bothered to replace. It was always quiet this late. Most of my neighbors kept to themselves, and by now, most of them were probably asleep. I usually found comfort in the silence, but tonight, something about it felt off. The air was still, too still. No hum of distant televisions, no muffled voices from behind the walls. Just me, the low buzz of the flickering lights, and the sound of my own footsteps. And they sounded wrong. Too sharp, too crisp, as if the hallway were somehow emptier than usual. I glanced down the corridor. My apartment was at the far end, past a row of identical doors. It wasn't a long walk, but tonight, something felt different. I started forward, my shoes clicking against the floor. After a few steps, I hesitated. Had the hallway always been this long? I knew the layout by heart. I walked this path every single day, but tonight, the distance stretched unnaturally. The door to my apartment should have been closer by now. I stopped and turned back toward the elevator. The doors were still there, exactly where they should be. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't sleep-deprived. But something was wrong. The lights flickered again, casting shifting shadows against the walls. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a ripple in the dimness, like the air itself had stirred. My heartbeat quickened. I shook my head and kept walking. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe I just needed to get inside. But the hallway stretched on, and my apartment door never seemed to get any closer. I kept walking, my eyes locked on my apartment door at the end of the corridor. But the more I walked, the more something gnawed at the edges of my mind. The numbers on the doors, they weren't right. I passed 3C, Mrs. Patel's place. Then 3D, where that quiet couple lived. Then 3E, my apartment. I reached for my keys, relief washing over me, until I saw another 3C just a few steps ahead. I stopped cold. My breath hitched in my throat. That didn't make sense. 3C was behind me. I turned around. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, identical doors lining the walls. The elevator was nowhere in sight. My pulse hammered in my ears. I knew this building. I had lived here for almost 2 years. The hallway was not this long. It could not be this long. I took a step back, then another. My shoes made too much noise in the stillness. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I turned again, walking faster now, my heart pounding. The numbers on the doors blurred together as I passed. 3C, 3D, 3E, then again, 3C, 3D, 3E. I sucked in a sharp breath. This wasn't possible. I was looping. Somehow, impossibly, the hallway was folding in on itself, keeping me trapped in a path that should not exist. I needed to get out. I rushed to the stairwell door and shoved against it. Locked. I jiggled the handle, yanked hard. Nothing. It wouldn't budge, as if it had been sealed shut. My fingers trembled as I turned to the elevator. The silver doors stood still, their surface dull under the flickering lights. I jabbed the call button. It didn't light up. I pressed it again. Harder. No response. My breathing quickened. The silence of the hallway pressed against me, heavy and unnatural. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a sound, so faint I almost missed it. A scraping, something moving along the walls. I swallowed hard, my back pressed against the cold metal of the elevator. My eyes darted from one end of the hallway to the other. But there was nothing. No movement. Just the hallway. Just the endless stretch of doors repeating in an impossible loop. And the quiet, insistent sound of something shifting just beyond my sight. Panic set in. I couldn't just stand here, trapped in this impossible loop. Someone had to be home. Someone had to help me. I turned to the nearest door, 3C, again, and knocked hard. Hello. My voice echoed strangely in the still air. Anyone home? No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, though it felt strangely cold under my knuckles. I moved to the next door, 3D, and pounded on it. Silence. I went door to door, slamming my fist against each one, my voice rising with each plea. Please, I need help. Is anyone here? Nothing. The silence was absolute. Not a creak, not a shuffle. No distant hum of a fridge, no muffled TV sounds. It was as if every single apartment had been abandoned. Or worse, like they had never been occupied at all. A cold sweat slicked my skin. I reached for the nearest doorknob and twisted. To my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, and I braced myself for whatever was inside. But there was no apartment. No furniture, no walls, no signs of life. Just another hallway, identical to the one I was standing in. The same flickering lights, the same muted colors, the same stretch of repeating doors. I stepped back, my stomach twisting. This was impossible. The layout of the building didn't allow for this. There should be an apartment here. A real, lived-in space. Not this. I turned back, and the door behind me clicked shut on its own. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't touched it. My hands were still at my sides. But the door had closed anyway. I grabbed the handle and yanked. Locked. I was sealed inside this new, identical hallway. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on my skin. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and I swore they had dimmed. Shadows stretched unnaturally against the walls. Then, just behind me, so close I could almost feel it, a sound, a slow, measured exhale. Someone, something, was breathing right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, ears straining. The exhale I had heard, it was real. I wasn't imagining it. But when I finally forced myself to turn, There was nothing. Just the hallway. Just the doors. Just the silence. But then, it wasn't silent anymore. Somewhere in the distance, faint murmurs drifted through the still air, low and indistinct, like voices bleeding through thin walls. I held my breath, listening. At first, I thought it was just the sound of neighbors talking. Finally, a sign of life in this dead, looping nightmare. But the more I listened, the more wrong it felt. The whispers weren't coming from inside the apartments. They were coming from the walls themselves. I stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. The voices grew clearer, sharpening into words. "He's almost here." I stopped cold. My stomach twisted. Were they talking about me? "Keep walking." My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a step back. The whispers grew insistent. "Don't turn around." I turned anyway. Nothing. Just that endless, unbroken stretch of hallway behind me. A cold sweat crawled down my back. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see them, but they could see me. Then, from inside the walls, something scratched. A long, slow drag of nails against drywall. I stumbled back, heart hammering. The sound moved with me, following, tracing my steps as if something on the other side of the wall was keeping pace. Then came the knocking. A dull, rhythmic thud. 1, 2, 3. It stopped. I took a shaky step forward. Thud, thud, thud. The knocking matched my movements, as if something or someone was just beyond the walls, mirroring me. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I needed to get out. I needed to wake up, to shake off whatever kind of twisted dream this was. Then, ahead of me, a door creaked open. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft, slow movement, as if something on the other side had nudged it open. The door, slightly ajar, swung wider. Beyond it, there was no apartment, no furniture, no light, just darkness, a black void, swallowing everything beyond the frame. Something about it was wrong, a darkness too deep, too absolute, like staring into a space that shouldn't exist. And then, from within the blackness, a whisper, "Come in." I didn't move. I couldn't. The doorway yawned open before me, a black void where an apartment should have been. The whisper from inside, "Come in," was soft, almost inviting. But I knew better. I stepped back. The moment I did, a sound drifted through the hallway. A laugh, faint, breathless, a low chuckle that echoed in the still air. It didn't come from the darkness. It didn't come from behind me. It didn't come from anywhere. It came from everywhere. My body tensed. It wasn't the laugh of a person. Not quite. It had a wetness to it, something stretched and unnatural, like the hallway itself was finding amusement in my fear. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe. I wasn't going to panic. I wasn't going to give it that satisfaction. Then, as I blinked, something changed. The hallway had shifted. It wasn't obvious, not at first. But the moment my eyes opened again, I saw the difference. One of the ceiling lights was flickering now, one that had been steady before. The air smelled different, stale, like old wood and something faintly metallic. And at the far end of the hall, the shadows looked deeper than they had a second ago. I swallowed, taking another step back. The laugh was gone, but the feeling of it lingered in the air, like an aftertaste of something rotten. This thing, whatever it was watching me. I could feel it. And worse, it was playing with me. Each time I blinked, it twisted something in my surroundings. Small changes. Just enough to remind me that I had no control. I had to do something. But what? Keep walking? That hadn't worked before. I had been looping endlessly, and now the hallway itself was changing. Where would I even go? Open another door? The last one led to an empty hallway. And this open one, the whisper from inside still echoed in my ears. Come in. What if stepping through is worse than staying here? Stand still? Do nothing? Wait? Let whatever was laughing at me get closer? I exhaled slowly, fists clenched. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I had to choose. And I had to choose now. My pulse hammered in my ears. I had to move. I had to do something. I spun around, ready to run back the way I came. But the hallway wasn't the same anymore. The door I had originally entered through, the one that should have led back to the stairwell, was gone. In its place, the corridor stretched endlessly, repeating itself like a sickening optical illusion. My stomach twisted. Then the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't distant murmurs bleeding through the walls. They were speaking to me. You should never have looked back. I choked on a breath, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. The hallway's far end, the place where the shadows had deepened before, darkened even further. Something was there. Something was stepping forward. At first, it was just an absence of light, a space where the dim glow of the overhead bulbs couldn't seem to reach. But then, the blackness shifted, taking form. A figure. Tall. Thin. Too tall. Its movements were slow, too deliberate, like it wasn't walking but pulling itself forward. I couldn't see its face, not yet, but I didn't want to. Then the lights flickered. For a split second, the hallway plunged into darkness. When they flickered back on, the figure was closer. My chest tightened. No. 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 Another flicker. The air thickened, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. The lights flickered again, and this time I saw its face. Hollow eyes. Deep, empty sockets where something should have been. Its mouth hung slightly open, as if frozen in the middle of a breath or a word. The lights flickered, and it moved again. I couldn't breathe. The whispers swelled around me, a chorus of voices laughing and pleading all at once. Then, at the far end of the hallway, where there had been nothing but endless repetition, a door, wide open. Beyond it, I couldn't see anything, not another hallway, not an apartment. Just a deep, grayish void. It didn't matter. It was the only way out. I ran. The laughter behind me twisted into something worse, a warped, distorted wail, stretching impossibly long, too loud for this space. I sprinted, my feet pounding against the floor, my breath ragged. The hallway warped as I moved, the walls pressing closer, the ceiling feeling lower. The lights flickered one last time, and the figure was right behind me. I dove through the door, and everything went black. I gasped awake. For a moment, I couldn't move, my body stiff, my lungs burning like I'd been holding my breath for too long. My eyes darted around, my pulse hammering in my ears. I was home. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, my back against the couch. The dim glow of my lamp cast soft shadows against the walls. Everything looked normal, but I didn't feel normal. My hands were trembling. My shirt was damp with sweat. My heart was still racing like I had just finished running. I swallowed hard and fumbled for my phone. The screen lit up. 11:37 p.m. That wasn't right. That was the exact time I had checked before I entered the hallway. Before everything had to. I stopped myself. My throat was dry. I forced my stiff legs to move, pushing myself up. My apartment looked the same. The same cluttered desk. The same unwashed dishes in the sink. My jacket was still draped over the chair where I had left it. It was all normal, wasn't it? I turned toward the front door. It was locked. The deadbolt was still in place. Slowly, I stepped closer and pressed my ear against it. Silence. I hesitated, then reached for the peephole. The hallway outside stretched in both directions, just like always. The same dim lighting, the same beige carpet. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe I just had some kind of waking nightmare, a sleep-deprived hallucination. But then, down the hall, just for a second, the lights flickered. I sucked in a sharp breath. The hallway stayed quiet. The lights stabilized. Nothing moved. I exhaled, shaking my head. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I had just. Then, just as I turned the deadbolt, right on the other side of the door, a faint, breathy laugh. I slammed the lock back into place, and this time, I didn't look back. The day we moved into our first house was one of the happiest moments of our lives. Emily and I had spent months searching for the perfect place, and when we found the small wooden house nestled at the edge of a quiet rural town, it felt like fate. The house had character, tall windows framed by white shutters, a wraparound porch that creaked under our footsteps, and an old oak tree standing guard in the front yard. It was the kind of place where we imagined growing old together. The real estate agent, a woman named Linda, assured us that despite its age, the house was in excellent condition. "It's been well cared for," she said with a practiced smile. Solid structure, new plumbing, and a fresh coat of paint. We had no reason to doubt her. The price was surprisingly affordable, but we chalked it up to being far from the city. The first night, as we unpacked boxes in the dim glow of our living room lamp, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. I paused, listening, but Emily kept talking excitedly about where to put the bookshelves. The noise stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling, an old structure adjusting to our presence. Over the next few days, little oddities began to stack up. A draft of cold air would brush against my neck, even though the windows were shut. Doors would creak open slightly, even when I was certain I had closed them. And that scratching sound, it came back, always faint, always just on the edge of hearing. But we were too wrapped up in the excitement of making the house our own to think much of it. Emily spent hours picking out curtains and rugs, while I focused on setting up our bedroom and fixing minor details. At night, we would fall into bed exhausted, whispering about the life we were going to build here. If only we had paid closer attention. That first night in our new home should have been peaceful. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the woods beyond our backyard. The house was quiet except for the occasional groan of old wooden beams adjusting to the night. Emily and I lay in bed, the warm glow of our bedside lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. We were exhausted but happy, whispering about our future, about the dinners we'd cooked together, the lazy Sundays spent reading on the porch. Then we heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from within the walls. It was subtle at first, like the rustling of paper or the distant scurry of a mouse in the attic. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, maybe a few rodents hiding in the walls. Old houses always had quirks, but the sound didn't stop. It became more distinct, more deliberate. A slow, rhythmic scraping, not the erratic movement of mice or the natural groans of an aging house. It was measured, a sound with purpose. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Emily tensed beside me, gripping my arm. Did you hear that? I forced a chuckle, trying to make light of it. Probably just some critters in the walls. I'll check it out in the morning. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. She lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin. I tried to ignore the sound, to will myself to sleep. But every time my eyes grew heavy, the scraping would start again. Slow, rhythmic, as if something was tracing its way along the inside of the walls. At some point, the noise stopped, but Emily still couldn't sleep. She shifted restlessly, pulling the blankets tighter around her. James, she whispered after what felt like hours. Yeah, I feel like someone's watching us. I sighed and turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It's just a new place, Em. It takes time to adjust. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes flickered toward the dark corners of the room. I didn't want to admit it, but something felt off. The air in the room was heavy, almost charged. I had the irrational urge to look over my shoulder, to make sure we were truly alone. Eventually, exhaustion won, and Emily's breathing evened out. I forced my own eyes shut, but as I drifted toward sleep, a final thought lingered in my mind. The scraping had never moved past the bedroom walls. It had stayed right there. Close. Too close. Listening. The next morning, Emily was quieter than usual. She moved through the house with a distracted air, her eyes lingering on the walls as if expecting them to shift or whisper. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, focusing instead on unpacking. By midday, we had made a decent dent in the boxes. I was setting up the bookshelves in the living room when I heard Emily's voice from the kitchen. James, come look at this. Her tone was off, hushed, uncertain. I set down the stack of books and walked in to find her standing by the kitchen door, staring at the wooden frame. The paint was chipped, revealing the older layers beneath. But it wasn't just peeling paint that had caught her attention. There, barely visible under years of wear, were faint, scribbled words. The handwriting was rough, as if someone had etched the warning in a hurry. The edges of the letters were uneven, like they had been scratched in with something sharp. I exhaled sharply, trying to think of something logical. Probably a prank from the previous owners, I said, running a finger over the words. Or maybe just a weird old note. You know how people write strange things on walls before painting over them? Emily didn't look convinced. Why would someone write that? I shrugged. It's an old house. Maybe it meant something to them. She chewed her lip, clearly uneasy, but eventually nodded and returned to unpacking. But the strange messages didn't stop there. That afternoon, while rearranging furniture in the hallway, Emily called for me again. This time, her voice was thinner, her breath unsteady. When I stepped into the hallway, she was standing by the wall near the staircase, one hand pressed against the old wallpaper. Part of it had peeled away as she was moving a small cabinet, revealing something scrawled beneath. The words sent a chill up my spine. They looked more desperate than the first message, the letters uneven, jagged. Someone had written them with urgency. Emily turned to me, her face pale. "James, this isn't normal." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to agree, to say that something about this house felt wrong. But the rational side of my mind fought back. "It's probably just an inside joke from the previous owners," I said, forcing a smile. "Or maybe some kind of unfinished horror-themed decor. You know how people like creepy aesthetic stuff." Emily's arms crossed tightly over her chest. "That's not funny." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. Okay. Look, we can paint over it. Cover it up. It's just words, Em. It doesn't mean anything." She didn't respond right away. Instead, her gaze flickered back to the message, as if expecting the letters to shift before her eyes. A minute passed before she finally exhaled and nodded. "Fine, let's just finish unpacking." We went back to work, but a heaviness lingered between us. Emily wasn't the only one who felt it. I told myself it was just the power of suggestion, that these messages were nothing more than the ramblings of some long-gone homeowner. But for the rest of the day, the house felt different. The silence wasn't comforting. It was expectant, and for the first time since moving in, I found myself wondering, who had lived here before us, and why did they leave? That night, the house didn't feel like ours anymore. Emily went to bed early, exhausted from the long day, but I stayed up for a while, scrolling through my phone in the dim light of the living room. I told myself I was just unwinding, but in truth, I didn't want to go to sleep. Not yet. The silence in the house felt unnatural, as if the walls were holding their breath. Then the sound came again. At first, it was the same faint scraping from the night before. But as I sat there, every muscle tensed, it grew louder. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. The slow, deliberate rhythm sent ice through my veins. This wasn't just the house settling. It was moving, tracing the length of the walls, shifting from one side of the room to the other. I stood up, my heart pounding. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. I turned on the nearest lamp, flooding the room with warm light. The sound stopped instantly. I swallowed hard, forcing out a breath. "Old house," I muttered under my breath. "That's all it is." But when I finally went to bed, I double-checked the locks on all the doors, just in case. At some point in the night, I woke with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. There was no sound, no dream I could remember. Just a suffocating sense of unease, like something was wrong. I turned over to check on Emily. She was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. Then I noticed it. A draft. Cold air brushing against my skin. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The room was freezing. I looked toward the bedroom door. Had we left a window open? Then I heard it. The soft creak of something swaying back and forth. I climbed out of bed and stepped into the hallway, my bare feet against the cold wood. The air was thick, heavy, almost electric. As I reached the living room, a sharp gust of wind blew through the house, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The back door was wide open. It swung gently on its hinges, creaking with each movement. Beyond it, the night was dark and still. I knew for a fact that I had locked it before bed. A shiver ran through me, but I forced myself forward, gripping the doorknob and yanking it shut. I locked it again, twice this time. My hands were shaking. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The house was silent again, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was thick, watching. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Emily woke up before me. I heard her footsteps down the hall, the soft shuffle of her slippers against the floor. Then she stopped abruptly. A second later, "James." Her voice was tight. I got out of bed and followed the sound of her voice into the kitchen. She was standing in the middle of the room, staring at the dining table. The chairs had been rearranged. Not just moved slightly, but completely turned, all four chairs facing outward, away from the table, as if waiting for someone to sit down. Neither of us spoke. I stepped forward, cautiously running my hand along the back of one chair. It was ice cold. Emily wrapped her arms around herself. We didn't do this. I swallowed hard. Maybe we bumped them while moving stuff around. She shook her head. No, her voice was barely above a whisper. No, James. Someone was in here. I wanted to argue, to say something logical, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew she was right. Something had changed in the house. And whatever it was awake now. Emily woke with a start. She didn't know why at first. There was no noise, no dream she could remember. Just an overwhelming sense of something wrong. The room was cold, unnaturally cold. The kind that settled into your bones, making the air feel thick and unmoving. She shifted under the blankets and turned her head toward the doorway. And that's when she saw it. A shadow. It stood in the open doorway, completely still. Tall, featureless, but unmistakably human-shaped. It wasn't cast by the moonlight or the street lamp outside. It was solid, darker than the rest of the room, an absence of light. Watching, Emily's breath caught in her throat. A wave of cold dread spread through her, but she couldn't move. She couldn't scream. All she could do was stare at it, frozen in place. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward James, gripping his arm. James, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't wake. Her heart pounded in her ears as she turned back toward the doorway. It was gone, just gone. The hallway beyond it was empty. No sound, no movement, only the suffocating silence of the house pressing down on her. Emily stayed awake for the rest of the night, curled against James, her body rigid with fear. But she didn't wake him, because somehow, deep down, she knew it would be back. The next morning, Emily barely touched her coffee. She was pale, her fingers wrapped tightly around the ceramic mug as if trying to ground herself. I noticed, of course. Didn't sleep well? I asked, trying to keep things light. She hesitated before nodding. Something woke me up. That's when I noticed the way she kept glancing toward the bedroom doorway, as if expecting something to be standing there. I was about to press her for more details when my foot brushed against something on the floor. A piece of wood. I frowned, looking down. Small splinters and paint chips littered the area near the baseboards. That's when I saw them. Deep, jagged scratch marks along the bedroom walls. For long gouges, uneven but deliberate, as if something had clawed at the wood in the middle of the night. They stretched from the doorframe all the way to the corner of the room. My stomach dropped. James, Emily's voice was tight. Tell me we did that. Tell me that was here before. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Because I knew the truth. It hadn't been there yesterday. Something had been trying to get in. I needed answers. That afternoon, while Emily sat in the kitchen with a faraway look in her eyes, I made my way up to the attic. It was cramped and dusty, the kind of space no one ever really used. The single bulb overhead flickered weakly as I stepped inside. The air smelled stale, thick with time. I didn't know what I was looking for, but some instinct, told me to search. And that's when I found it. A small, dented metal box, half buried beneath old insulation. I pried it open, coughing as dust billowed up. Inside were a handful of old newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile with age. I picked one up and started reading. Local man vanishes from home. No sign of forced entry. My pulse quickened. I flipped to another. He spoke of a presence, says family. Missing man's journal mentions strange sounds, moving objects. My hands tightened around the brittle paper. And the last clipping, the one that made my breath catch in my throat, was dated exactly 30 years ago. It read simply, "House listed for sale after owner disappears. No one should live there. Family warns." My mouth went dry. I looked around the attic, suddenly feeling the weight of the house pressing in on me. The air seemed colder now, thicker. I wasn't alone up here. I could feel it. Something was still here, and it had been waiting. Emily was done. The moment I showed her the newspaper clippings, she slammed them down on the table, her hands trembling. "We have to go," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "James, we have to leave. Now." I exhaled, rubbing my temples. "Em, come on." "No, don't em me." Her eyes were wild. You saw those clippings. People vanished from this house. They warned people not to live here. I hesitated. It's just a house, I muttered, but even as I said it, the words felt hollow. She pushed the papers toward me, her fingers tightening into fists. Then how do you explain the messages on the walls? The sounds? The scratches? James, I saw. She stopped herself, shaking her head. I saw something last night. Standing in the doorway, watching. A chill ran down my spine. She was serious. I wanted to believe there was some rational explanation. But deep down, something in my gut twisted. Still, I tried to hold on to logic. Let's just stay one more night, I said finally, my voice softer. Tomorrow morning, we'll leave. I just need to process this. Emily stared at me for a long moment, her jaw clenched. Then she turned away. Fine, she said. But if anything else happens tonight, we run. We kept the lights on that evening. Neither of us said much. Even with the lamps glowing, the house felt wrong. The air was thick, oppressive. I could feel something just beyond my vision, waiting. By the time we got ready for bed, the temperature had dropped drastically. It felt like standing inside a freezer, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Emily climbed under the covers without a word. I slid in beside her, but neither of us turned off the bedside lamp. We lay there in silence, the weight of the house pressing down on us. Then, bang, the bedroom door slammed shut so hard the walls shook. Emily bolted upright. I shot out of bed, rushing toward the door. It wouldn't budge. The knob wouldn't turn. It was locked. James. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. I turned toward her. The floorboards in the hallway outside began to creak. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, slow. They started at the far end of the hall, moving toward our bedroom door. Thud, thud, thud. I could barely breathe. My heart pounded in my ears. Then, everything went still. Silence. Emily clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I swallowed hard, pressing my ear against the door. Nothing, just when I thought. A deep, guttural voice whispered from the other side of the door. Low, hoarse, almost inhuman. You should have left. Emily let out a strangled sob. I grabbed her, pulling her against me, my own body shaking. The walls groaned. The house seemed to vibrate around us. Then, a dark stain began to seep through the walls. Thick, black, oozing downward in long, slow rivulets. It wasn't paint. It wasn't water. It looked like blood. The air grew even colder, biting at my skin. My breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. Then the whisper came again, this time closer. Get out. Something pounded against the door, so hard the wood cracked. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Emily's hand and pulled. We didn't stop to grab anything. We didn't stop to look back. We ran. I didn't think. I just acted. I threw my full weight against the door, my shoulders slamming into the wood with everything I had. Once. Twice. The third time, the lock snapped. The door flung open so violently that it hit the wall with a deafening crack. Emily was already moving. We tore through the hallway, down the stairs, nearly tripping over ourselves in our desperation to get out. The house groaned behind us, as if angry that we were leaving. The front door, locked when we went to bed, was already wide open. I didn't stop to question it. We sprinted outside, the icy air hitting us like a slap. I fumbled for the car keys in my pocket, hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped them. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the driveway so fast the tires screeched against the pavement. Neither of us spoke. The house shrank in the rearview mirror, swallowed by darkness. My hands were locked around the steering wheel, my pulse thudding against my skull. Then, Emily let out a sharp breath, her voice trembling. James, look. I didn't want to, but I did. In the second-story bedroom window, framed by the dim glow of the bedside lamp, someone was standing there, watching. It had no features, no eyes, no mouth, just darkness, still, unmoving, waiting. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, whispering, "Don't look, don't look, don't look." I pressed the gas pedal harder, and we never went back. The next day, we checked into a hotel 2 towns over. Neither of us had slept, and neither of us wanted to be alone. I started looking up the house's history, searching beyond what I'd already found. And that's when I noticed a pattern. Every past resident had never stayed longer than a year. Some only lasted months. None would speak about why they left. No interviews, no public statements, just sudden departures. The house returning to the market like a trap waiting for its next victim. We never went back to collect our things. The house, the furniture, the decorations, everything we had worked for, we left behind. It didn't matter. We were alive. But it wasn't over. The first night in the hotel, Emily woke up gasping. I turned over, blinking at her in the dim glow of the bedside clock. 3:03 a.m. Her breath came in sharp, panic bursts. She turned to me, her eyes wide and glassy. "James," she whispered. I sat up immediately. "What? What is it?" Her fingers curled into the sheets. She swallowed hard. I felt it." "Felt what?" I asked, but I already knew. She shivered. Her voice was barely audible. "Someone watching." I felt the cold return, just for a second. Thick, heavy, as if we had never really left. We escaped the house, but whatever was inside it never let us go.
And so, dear listeners, we reach the end, or perhaps just another beginning. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the shadows, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story haunted you the most. But before you go, remember, the dark is never truly empty.